So we all benefit from wireless services, including all the companies that are here and all the academics that are here. And clearly we need more wireless services. We've been talking about better wireless services. And we need all these wireless services sooner. But the current regulatory regime prevents us from getting that more better sooner. So Phil Weiser at the University of Colorado and I have 3 interlocking proposals to improve the situation. The first is harm claim thresholds. And these provide more clarity about the entitlements that people have for protection from harmful interference. The second is band agents, which address the fragmentation of spectrum control that prevents people from doing win-win negotiations. And the third is more effective adjudication of interference disputes that leads to more effective contracts. I'll go through all of these in the rest of the presentation, but the big caveat is that these ideas have been developed in the US regulatory context. I'm very interested in hearing in the discussion and perhaps afterwards comparing and contrasting with the European situation, and so what would apply here and what wouldn't apply here. But before I get into that, let me just say thank you very much. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. Thank you to Jens Zander and the program committee for inviting me. Thank you to the sponsors for making it possible for me to be here. And thank you to Jenny for all the help with logistics. And last but not least, thank you to all the people who helped us develop these ideas. Some of them are in the room, whether they agree with where we ended up or not. So I talked about more, better, and sooner for wireless services. Let me talk briefly about why and how. So as we all know, the value that people place on wireless keeps growing. So that means that demand keeps growing. And so more demand means that we have to pack more services together. We need to operate radios more closely to each other in time, space, and frequency. But as this audience knows better than I do, there are technical constraints on the ability of radios to operate more closely together. However, even though this is mostly an engineering conversation, it's not really a technical problem, fundamentally. Engineering entails costs. Costs means somebody has to bear the costs, which means you get into a discussion about rights and entitlements, which means you get into conversations with lawyers and economists, and that takes us to regulation, or more generally, the design of institutions. That, I think, is the hook to the nominal topic of this meeting. And we're talking about 5G. I'd say this presentation is about the big G, government. So do we actually have a problem? I could rehearse lots of examples of economic inefficiencies where there have been interference disputes that haven't been resolved in a win-win way, and or that haven't been resolved in a timely fashion, which essentially means a lot of loss. I'll just pick one as an example, which is the GPS light squared dispute in the US. And I picked it because it reveals the 3 frailties that I'm going to hang the 3 presentations around. So to recap, Light Squared is the current name of a mobile satellite service licensee in the US. They got a waiver in 2001 to operate ancillary terrestrial base stations known as complementary ground component here in Europe. Back from the start of this proceeding, back in 2001, 2002, 2003, the GPS community had concerns, but the concerns focused entirely on out-of-band emissions. In other words, spillover from light squared into the GPS frequencies. Nobody thought about adjacent band blocking. Until 2010, 2011, there was a firestorm of objections, essentially because of overload due to the signal in the light squared band, tens of megahertz away from the GPS, interfering, degrading the GPS signal, essentially due to the poor selectivity of the GPS receivers. And there are people in the room, like Doug, who were actually in the trenches during this time. So if you have any detailed questions, ask Doug, and Doug, be gentle on my story here. But where we ended up as a result of all of this was that the FCC withdrew their permission for Light Squared to operate terrestrial base stations in 2012. LightSquared filed for bankruptcy in 2013, and they're still there. They were in court last week. They're still in bankruptcy. So the root causes, I'm going to give you three, I think, that led to this problem. The first was a completely incompatible understanding between LightSquared and the GPS community over who had the rights and who had the responsibilities to protect against harmful interference. The second was that LightSquared tried to pack suitcases full of money and do deals. They flew around. They couldn't actually do deals with everybody because the community was fragmented, and also because of peculiarities of some of the entities they had to deal with, like the federal government. And the third problem was that this question of whether there actually was harmful interference wasn't adjudicated. It was decided in an extremely political process that involved intense lobbying of the FCC, probably back-channel communications between the federal government and the FCCs that the public didn't see, and contentious hearings in front of Congress. Now, my claim is that those three problems are not peculiar to the GPS LightSquared case. They show up repeatedly. So the first one is there's this unproductive uncertainty about spectrum operating entitlements. In other words, what are the rights and responsibilities that I have as an operator to protect other people from harmful interference? And what responsibilities do those other players have to protect themselves against reasonable interference? And that means that these parties hold wildly incompatible positions. There's this huge gulf, which is very difficult to close in negotiations and get to a win-win. The second problem, remember LightSquared trying to do deals? The second problem is a collective action problem. Most bands are fragmented among lots of licensees, lots of different services, and there are too many players that hold rights that block successful outcomes. And the third problem is that we don't have efficient, trusted adjudication. In the US, at least, everything always ends up at a rulemaking in front of the commissioners, not before a judge. Now, as people say on the West Coast, as they say in the IT business, this doesn't scale. So even if this regime that we have worked now, it's not going to work in future, where we have more cheek-to-cheek, dynamic, rapidly evolving spectrum services. We are not going to be able to do this in any kind of timescale that will deliver value. But of course, the thing is, it isn't even working now. If one looks at how long it takes the FCC to resolve even trivial disputes about interference, it takes at least 2 years for the simplest thing. And the FCC gets into the minutiae. For example, the one that just drove me nuts was in 800 megahertz. They ended up deciding about putting radios for train couplers on long trains, and they had to really delve into how a system operated. So the way we break this deadlock is we need to find a way for the regulators to delegate more of their powers, a way to decentralize negotiations. And so those are the three key tasks that I'm now going to address. I'm just going to give the headlines. We can drill down in discussion. If anybody wants to look at a paper that describes this stuff, I put the URL up over on the whiteboard over there. It's on bit.ly, bit.ly/unlocking spectrum, one word. So the first task is to reduce the ambiguity over who has responsibility for interference harm. The current way we do spectrum policy focuses almost entirely on transmitters, and it fails to address the role of receivers in harmful interference. And that was one of the problems with LightSquared, was the problem was really the receivers. Now, one solution is for the regulator to mandate receiver standards. We don't support that approach. We actually advocate harm claim thresholds. And this approach says the regulator states the interference level, in band and out of band, that an operator needs to tolerate. It leaves it up to them, up to their vendors, up to the manufacturers, to figure out how to deal with that interference. And in fact, industry may come up with receiver standards, but it's not something the regulator does. These harm claim thresholds will vary. It's not one harm claim threshold profile for everybody. It'll depend on the kinds of services that are being offered, the needs of the incumbents, the kinds of legacy receivers, what are the future uses of the band. But in spite of that, it's a pretty new idea. We've made good progress. It was first vetted as part of the PCAST Spectrum report. You know, there were a few other things in addition to the bits that everybody knows. There was a lot of discussion in the FCC Technological Advisory Council, led to a white paper. There was a public notice by the FCC, generally positive results. Footnote, essentially everybody said, this is a good idea as long as it's not in my band. And it turns out that there is no band whether it's going to be tried. The FCC's latest round of proposals for the 3.5 gigahertz brackets PCAST band actually is proposing harm claim threshold-like rules for the priority access services. That was task one. Task two is to overcome the drawbacks of excessive fragmentation. So what do I mean by that? If we look in the US, it happens to be a nice database on this, spectrum between 400 megahertz and 3.7 gig. So, you know, you go count, and you find that 40% of that spectrum, that's 1.3 gigahertz, is allocated to bands where each of those bands has 4 or more different services in the band, and either or both of its neighbors also have 4 or more distinct services, and each service will have hundreds or tens of thousands in some cases of licensees, of licenses. So that's a lot of fragmentation, lots of people that can block successful outcomes. There are existing proposals for solving that that are interesting, but we would argue that are insufficient. One is, well, let's just make the fragmentation problem go away. Let's just give everybody, every band has an exclusive licensee. Yeah, that will make fragmentation go away. I don't think we're going to get there overnight. I think there are some bands we're never going to get there. So we do need an alternative. Another alternative is sharing. That's a lot of talk about sharing at the moment. But I think even with sharing, one still needs to have a way to negotiate changes in the operating rules. The regulator will give us starting rules, but what if those rules are made obsolete through evolution in business models or evolution in technology? Will we have to go back to the regulator every time we want to change those things? If not, we need an alternative. And the alternative that we've proposed is introducing band agents. So band agents are entities that represent large group of operators. They work for licensed or unlicensed, but it allows these interests to negotiate changes between groups of operators. So that rather than having tens of thousands, you might have a handful. And it's particularly useful across band boundaries. If you want a mental model, think of it as band agents on steroids or frequency coordinators on steroids. Band managers and frequency coordinators manage interference within a band, but a band agent can also negotiate across a band boundary, and they can make and accept monetary payments. Lots of ways to implement this. We're still working on the details. One way is to use existing institutions. So start with band agents, start with band managers, start with frequency coordinators, and give them extra powers. So for example, in the US, we've got frequency coordinators in 800 and 900 megahertz. We've got the Department of Defense, we've got the FAA, we've got the NTIA. They might become band agents. Another approach is to reuse ideas from commercial law. So licensees could appoint band agents in the same way that shareholders in companies appoint management. The management actually strikes all the contracts, not the shareholders. And the third is for the FCC to explicitly allocate these kinds of rights, rights to alter parameters of band boundaries. Here's a way it might work in unlicensed. For example, a spectrum sharing database, a spectrum access system, could get the right to negotiate changes in operating rights with an incumbent, say. And they could, in fact, collect money from all the millions of unlicensed devices that use this spectrum access system and then make payments to the incumbent. That was task 2. Task 3 was improving the reliability and efficacy of dispute resolution. I think this one is perhaps the most country-specific. We propose moving to a more fact-based adjudication using judges, expert courts, rather than the regulators. And part of that actually is to allow parties to take action against each other. So if I feel I'm suffering from harmful interference from another party, I can actually take them to court. I don't have to go to the FCC and get the FCC to go chase them. The solution in the US, may be different in different places, is in fact two complementary paths. The one is that the FCC, which actually has administrative law judges, to actually use them. It has one or two, and they decide FM licensing decisions, apparently. So that the FCC, in fact, this would be the chairman of the FCC delegating some power to these judges. The alternative is for Congress to set up a new court, the Court of Spectrum Claims. That would be a nice hedge against the FCC not doing anything, because essentially it would be an alternative venue. But there's also a substantive reason for doing this, which is, given the peculiarities of how US spectrum policy works, you have split governance for federal spectrum and non-federal spectrum. There's no place where they have a shared venue. This court would decide problems if people are sharing federal and non-federal and they have a dispute, they would go to this court. So to summarize, I said that these three proposals interlock. So let me just sketch how they relate to each other. So my premise was that as we speed up, as we get more dynamic, closely packed systems, we need to delegate and decentralize the coordination, the orchestration, to use Dirk's term. To delegate, you need clearer entitlements to interference protection, since you can't go back to the regulator every time to say, so what do you mean by harmful interference this time? And that leads us to harm claim thresholds. But even if you have clear entitlements, that doesn't lead to good negotiating outcomes if you've got thousands of players trying to negotiate with each other. So you've got high transaction costs. That leads us to band agents, which bundle these together. But even if these negotiations succeed, and you get contracts, you still need a backstop. I mean, the reason why companies contract with each other is they know that if they have a problem, they can go to court. So you actually need to set up a court to adjudicate. And to close the loop, for a court, even a specialized court, it helps to have clarity on key concepts like interference, and therefore you have harm claim thresholds. The title of my talk was, Getting Beyond Command and Control. And the funny thing is that, for all the fuss and bother and polemic about licensed versus unlicensed, and I think the most recent incarnation of that is clearing versus sharing, most spectrum is still under command and control. So the real challenge, I think, for society at large is not to resolve this argument about licensed, exclusive license versus unlicensed, is how to get either of those and less command and control. And we believe that these three proposals will accelerate that kind of change. And this will unlock more of the potential of wireless that will actually give us the more, better, sooner that we all want. Thanks.